This is Punchback, a Pambazuka News production that provides comments and analysis on current affairs from a Pan-African perspective. With me, Henry McCoy. Welcome. You must have heard of the name Aylan Kurdi. That is the name of a Syrian boy, 3 years old, whose body was found on a beach in Turkey. Aylan is believed to have been running away from the war in Syria. The war in Syria broke out in 2011 when rebels began their resistance against the regime of Bashar al-Assad. It is believed that the West, or Britain and the US, are behind this war by supporting the rebels in an attempt for regime change. Aylan is one of the thousands of refugees who are arriving from this country, where more than 300,000 people are believed to have been killed since the war broke out. 7 million have been displaced internally, and up to 4 million people are believed to have run away seeking refuge in neighboring countries. The war is still on, and many of these refugees who are running away to seek refuge in Europe are being turned back, because up until now, the belief is that within Europe, among European leaders, is that these are people who are running away to go and enjoy the good life in Europe, or they are people who are being trafficked by various traffickers who make money out of the misery of those people who are running away from war or conflict zones. But is that the truth? Is that exactly what's happening in these countries where people are running away? And it's not only Syria, it's not only in the Arab world. It is known that Libya was destabilized with the overthrow of Muammar Gaddafi by the NATO forces. The image of this toddler Aylan lying on a beach in Turkey tells a totally different story. And it's the story of the rejection, the inhumane attitude of European powers towards refugees. It must be recalled that refugees have protection under international law. Other than the humanitarian need for people to support other human beings who are in trouble, there are international laws that govern protection of refugees. But Europe is not concerned about this. Europe is only concerned about protecting its borders from what is seen as an invasion by refugees who are running away from countries which they themselves have destroyed. It is Europe that is responsible. It is the Western world, Europe, the US and Europe, that are responsible for the destruction of these countries from where people are running away. There is Iraq, there is Libya, there is Afghanistan, there is Somalia, and so many other countries around the world. How does the West look at this refugee crisis, which is believed to be the largest since the Second World War? The West believes that the refugees are running away from their own countries to go to Europe, to go to America, to enjoy the good life in those countries. Secondly, the West believes that this is the work of human traffickers. But in reality, even without the presence of human traffickers, the question of refugees is real. These are people who are running away to protect their lives, to save their lives and the lives of their children from persecution, from wars in their own countries. What's most interesting is that these wars have been caused by the West itself in its attempts to control the world, to control the resources of the world, and to continue dominating the resources and people of the world. So it is not true that these people are always running away from their own countries, which are poor. In fact, many of these countries are rich, but their resources have been looted by the West. And so the people are left poor. The people are left without anything. And so they have to look for better life in other countries. The Western world wants total control of the resources of the rest of the world. And in the case of Syria, there is a desire to control oil and gas, not just in Syria, but in the Middle East. President Assad represents the rejection of Western interests in the Arab world. And that's why there has been a plan, particularly by the US and Britain, to have regime change in Syria, to remove Assad and to put in his place a puppet regime that can accede to the interests of the West. And so the resistance that is playing out in Syria has got everything to do with the control of oil and gas in the Arab world and the strategic interests of the Western world within that region. British Prime Minister David Cameron describes the refugee crisis in Europe as swarms of migrants seeking to enter Europe. Other European leaders have expressed also their rejection of refugees in similar terms. But this is not true. The truth is that these are refugees, and the Western world, as all the other countries of the world, owe them a duty of care. The Western world thrives on a situation of permanent war in the world. That's why they arm rebels. That's why they provoke rebellions in other countries, so that they are able to sell their arms. Who manufactures the arms that are used around the world in wars? In Africa and other places where these wars are being fought, where are the arms sourced from? The Western world relies on their arms industry to make billions of dollars each year. And that's why they have to cause war in other parts of the world. That's why they have to destabilize other countries in order to have markets for their arms, as well as to come in as saviors so that they can continue their hegemony of controlling the world. At the same time, the warmongers in the Western world have arrogated to themselves the responsibility of being the global cop. They go around the world preaching human rights and democracy. But within their own countries, if examined very closely, there are very serious human rights violations. And their own invasion of other countries, their own destruction of the economies of other countries, their looting of resources is never seen as a human rights issue at all. Human rights are only a problem in the third world, and not the activities of destruction that the Western world engages in other countries. They are also violators. In fact, they are the prime violators of human rights around the world. Ordinary human beings are mere collateral damage in the wars that are launched by the Western world in search of resources, in search of money, in search of capital. It must be called that in the global scheme of things, capital is free to move around the world, but not labor, but not human beings. Whereas investors go all over the world to look for resources, to set up industries, to set up businesses, this is acceptable, but not labor. The movement of human beings is tightly controlled. Why is it that capital is free to move from place to place, but not labor? Why is it that money can move from one country to another, from one regime to another, without a care of the actual realities of those regimes, but not labor, but not human beings? Human beings are seen as a menace. Human beings are seen as something that causes trouble in these great nations of the West, and they should remain in their own countries. In fact, the policy that is being pursued by Europe and other Western powers is to allow as many as possible of those migrants to drown in the Mediterranean Sea. This is it. The problem of refugees as we have it presently is a question of imperialism. The Western powers have destroyed the rest of the world through war. And so, there are so many people who are hopeless in these countries, who do not have peace, who do not have the basics of life so that they can build their own nations, they can build their own lives. And so they have to move away from these places which have been destroyed by the West. And when they are moving to Europe, when they are moving to America, they are resisted, they are rejected. They are told to go back to those countries which have been destroyed by the same powers that are rejecting them. This is not just. And so, all the people of the world who believe in peace, who believe in justice, must reject imperialism, must reject the desire of the Western countries to control the world. The people have a right to self-determination, to have the freedom to build their own countries. There is the issue of the resource curse, which means that countries that are endowed with resources, many of them in the third world, in Africa, are at risk of being destabilized by the Western powers, which want to control those resources. Countries like Nigeria, countries like the Democratic Republic of Congo, which have been destabilized by the Western powers in their push to control the resources in those countries. These oil and other mineral resources that are found in these countries are controlled by powerful multinational companies. owned by the West, which repatriate huge profits into their countries every year. And the people who live in these countries do not benefit at all, or benefit very little from the exploitation of these oil resources. And the resources, in fact, are a curse in another sense, in that the extraction of these resources has often led to very, very extensive destruction of the environment in these countries. So, what do the people of the world need to do? The resources that are found in the third world, in Africa, in African countries, in Nigeria, in Kenya, in Tanzania, belong to these countries. And the people of these countries must be the first ones to benefit from these resources before anyone else. Take the example of Muammar Gaddafi of Libya. Of course, he was not an angel. He was not democratic according to Western standards. But he ran a country where people were satisfied, where people had all the things that they needed. But with the destruction of that country following the NATO intervention, Libya is in complete shambles. According to one report, there are more than 170 different rebel groups now roaming around the country. There is no governance, the country has been destroyed. Why? Because Libya under Muammar Gaddafi represented resistance, African resistance to Western domination. Muammar Gaddafi was clear, very clear in his mind, that Africa had to be sovereign. Africa had to be respected. The continent had to develop its own mechanisms, to develop its own currency, to cut its dependence from the West and become a noble continent of happy and proud people. And this runs counter to the Western narrative, or to the Western wish for the African nations, which they want to be always dependent on IMF and the World Bank. And this is exactly why Muammar Gaddafi was overthrown, so that his dream of a united, progressive Africa could be destroyed with him. But the African people remain very vigilant. The African people must resist all the attempts of the Western powers to continue to overrun their countries, to continue to intervene in their own countries. These are sovereign nations that must be respected in the global community of nations. The murder of Muammar Gaddafi by NATO and their allies did not only destabilize Libya, but the entire region of North Africa and the Arab world. And so there was the rise of armed rebel groups, the so-called terrorists, many of them allied to Al-Qaeda and other terrorist networks. A lot of Africans will go to Libya to find jobs, and with the destruction of that country, that ended. And so many of them now running away from war, from Eritrea, from Sudan, from West Africa, are finding their way, attempting to go to Europe to find a better life for themselves. And so there is a direct connection between the destruction of Libya, the destabilization of North Africa, and the Arab world with what's going on right now, so-called refugee crisis in Europe. What do you think? For how long will this crisis go on? How will the refugee problem be solved? The problem lies with the destruction of African nations by the West. So with the end of the destruction of African nations by the West, the refugee crisis will stop. So people who are really interested in finding a solution to the refugee crisis must look at the source of the problem. They must address the continued intervention of Western powers in Africa, in the third world, where they're destroying nations and rendering people hopeless. And these are the people who are running away from situations of war, seeking refuge in the West. And then when they get to those countries, they are rejected. They are forced to drown in the seas. So all progressive people must unite. There is a need for a global movement against imperialism, to fight against the hegemony of Western powers, so that Africa can be free, so that we can build our nations, we can use our own resources to benefit our people, so they don't have to run away from our countries to seek refuge in the West.